Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. My name is Daniel Rothenberg, and I'm co-director of the Center on the Future of War. So those of you who might be new to our speaker series, I'll just say a few words about the center, and then we'll get right on to the event. The center is now in its 7th year. We are a partnership between Arizona State University and a think tank in DC called New America. We run a whole series of different programs, obviously events like this one. We do a major annual conference called the Future Security Forum. We designed and run an online MA in global security. We have various research projects on drones and domestic international terrorism, fieldwork projects in Syria, Iraq, and some work on proxy warfare and other projects. But one thing we're particularly proud of is being able to bring to all of you, we used to do this in person, but now we do this online, really exceptional thinkers speaking broadly about security issues. Not necessarily about war in the classic understanding, but about issues that are at the core of what drives conflict. So tonight, we're thrilled to have Noah Feldman speaking to us tonight. His talk is called When Does Resistance Become Insurrection? Free Speech and the Defense of the Republic. There could hardly be a more significant theme and issue to deal with right now. So very briefly, some housekeeping. Noah will speak for a period of time, and then we'll get into Q&A. For all of you who want to present questions, please use the Zoom question feature. So you just type your questions into the Zoom, and then I'll play the role of moderator, and I'll present as many of the questions as we have time for to our speaker. And we end at 6:30. Sometimes we go a few minutes later, but our goal is to sort of stick with programs. So Noah Feldman is Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He's also chairman of the Society of Fellows at Harvard. He specializes in constitutional studies with a particular emphasis on the relationship between law and religion, free speech, constitutional design, and the history of legal theory. In 2003, he served as the senior constitutional advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. Seems like a lifetime ago. And subsequently advised members of the Iraqi Governing Council on the drafting of the Transitional Administrative Law, or the Interim Constitution. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He earned his DPhil in Oriental Studies from Oxford University. He was a law clerk to Justice David Souter on the US Supreme Court. He's the author of 9 books, including Arab Winter, A Tragedy, The 3 Lives of James Madison, Genius, Partisan President, and Cool War, The Future of Global Competition. And he was also a national fellow with the New America Fellows Program, which is particularly significant to us because, as many of you know, some of our speakers are ASU Future Security Fellows who are members of the annual National Class of Fellows that we support through our program. So we're thrilled to welcome Noah to our audience, and the floor is yours.
Daniel, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and I want to add that not only was I recently a national fellow of the Peter Bergen's program at New America, but also at the very beginning of my academic career when I was a little tiny baby professor, I was also a fellow of New America, now more than 20 years ago, right around the time that Daniel and I actually met each other. So I'm very, very pleased to be here and to have a chance to talk to you guys. As you can tell from the topic, I decided I would choose something very boring and non-controversial and not connected to current events. What I'm going to try to do on these potentially very controversial and contentious questions is present both sides of a series of complex issues and try to present both sides fairly, but also in the strongest form of argument that they have. And then at the end of my comments, I'll say a word or two about how those things might be balanced. But I really am hoping that in the Q&A, we can hash out some of these really challenging and important questions. The way I see the core question facing us in the aftermath of the January 6th attacks on the Capitol is as follows. We can probably all agree as a matter of consensus, no matter where we are on the political spectrum, that the First Amendment to the Constitution gives us and should give us a right to express ourselves peacefully in any lawfully designated place, including the outdoor spaces around the Capitol, and to say under those circumstances just about anything we might want to say that would express our political values and beliefs, even if our words are not particularly civil, provided that we don't engage in any form of action that could be categorized as violence. We can probably also all agree that violent conduct, breaking down security barriers, breaking into a building, pushing and shoving away police, and potentially doing even much greater forms of violence, vandalism or physical harm to others, are and should be unlawful, and are and should be outside the bounds of what we consider to be permissible political expression in the United States. So both of those things are, in a general sense, pretty easy to agree on. What's harder, I think, is the complicated question of at what point speech, including speech by the then president, Donald Trump, encouraging people to express themselves, turns to incitement under the law. That is, turns from permissible protected speech, protected by the First Amendment and by our political traditions, and turns into something that is impermissible because it counts as inciting, and I'll say more about that word in a few moments, the crowd to take unlawful or violent action. So that's the first hard question that I'm going to be talking about. The second hard question I'm going to be talking about is whether even after violence has occurred, like the violence outside the Capitol or that took place inside the Capitol, whether that violence is correctly to be characterized as an insurrection, as the article of impeachment adopted by the House of Representatives did, because it accused Donald Trump of incitement to insurrection, not just incitement to violence or unlawful action, but as incitement to insurrection proper. Or alternatively, whether, no matter what we decide on the first question about speech becoming incitement, whether the protests which led to the attack on the Capitol should not fairly be categorized as insurrection, but should be called something else. Not peaceful protests, because they at some point were no longer peaceful, but as protests focused, let's say, on the fairness of the election, rather than being focused on insurrection, with the specific meaning that that usually has, namely seeking the violent overthrow of the relevant government. So those are the two parts of what I want to discuss, and I'm going to do them each in turn. And then, as I say, I'm very eager to hear your views about it. On each of these questions that I'm going to discuss, there are, I think, reasonable people who have strongly held views on different sides of the question. And I want to try to express the strongest form of each argument, as I mentioned. So let's start with the argument that Donald Trump's words did rise to the level of incitement to violence. This is the view taken by the majority of the House of Representatives when it impeached Donald Trump, and it is arguably the view rejected by the Senate when the Senate acquitted Donald Trump after his impeachment trial. I say arguably because many of the senators said that the reason they were voting to acquit Donald Trump was not that they were taking any position on his actual conduct, but rather that they thought that it was unconstitutional to try someone who was no longer in office. And so we don't know for certain whether their votes were based on a view of the president's conduct or not. So I don't want to insist that it was. But there is an argument to say that this view was rejected by the Senate of the United States. So you have some form of authority just from the two houses of Congress on both sides of this question. The argument that Donald Trump did commit incitement could be understood in terms of the strongest case for it, which would claim that this was incitement even under the terms of the First Amendment, which defines incitement in Supreme Court case law interpreting the First Amendment as follows. The operative definition of incitement that currently exists, which comes from a 1969 Supreme Court case called Brandenburg against Ohio, says that you've committed incitement if you use words that are directed to the imminent, unlawful use of force, and it's a both-and test, and also that your speech did in fact have a high probability of leading to imminent lawless action. That's the so-called Brandenburg test. Now, before I apply it, just a word of background. Many of you will be familiar with the famous Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes of the Supreme Court, who in 1919, just about a century ago, expressed a different test for incitement. And his test was that something counts as incitement if the words pose a clear and present danger of violent action. That's the same opinion in which Holmes famously said that free speech goes pretty far, but it doesn't go so far as to yell fire falsely in a crowded theater. People tend to forget that he said falsely. They say, Holmes said you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, but Holmes said you can't yell fire falsely in a crowded theater. And in that same opinion, Holmes expressed this clear and present danger test, which in various forms was the test that the Supreme Court used from 1919 all the way up to 1968. The Brandenburg test from 1968 is more protective of speech, more permissive of speech, even than the clear and present danger test. Because it says not only that the conduct must be likely to cause imminent lawlessness, which is what Holmes was talking about, but also that it must be directed to that end. Now, the directed to that end might mean that the words literally call for violence, or it might mean that the intent of the speaker was to create violence. No one knows for sure, and the courts are divided about what the Supreme Court's test actually meant there, but either way, it involves a higher standard than just the probability that the words will create this violent effect. The case advanced by the House managers in the impeachment trial was, to put it pretty simply with respect to this point, that Donald Trump's speech did have the direct effect of pushing the crowd to enter the Capitol and to do so violently and unlawfully, and that his words were directed to accomplishing that. So let's ask first whether President Trump's words literally were directed towards that. And the answer, I think, fairly is no. They weren't literally directed towards that. Although he did use the phrase, we must fight hard. That's a sort of metaphoric term that politicians use all the time. But, so the literal meaning of the words was not to incite. But it's also the case that we know that it's possible to incite a crowd to violence without ever saying the words, "go be violent." The famous example that's usually given by First Amendment experts when they talk about this is the speech that Mark Antony gives in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. And in the play, as you'll recall, Mark Antony has promised the people who killed Caesar, who were momentarily in charge, he's promised them that he won't say anything negative about them. And so he famously says they were all honorable men, and he says that Brutus was an honorable man. So even as he insists on the honorable nature of the people who've killed Caesar, he manages to rile the crowd up to such a rage that they riot and they ultimately overthrow the conspirators who killed Caesar, and civil war ensues. So that's an example of how you can rile up a crowd, admittedly taken from fiction, or fictionalized history, historical fiction, I suppose, of how you can rile a crowd up without ever using the word. And there is, I think, a plausible argument to be made, again, made by the House managers, that in context, Trump's speech was directed to inciting violence in that sense. The argument would be that he understood, and the crowd understood, that this came at the end of months of claiming that the election was illegitimate, that the point of being there was to stop the process, the democratic process, whereby Joe Biden was going to become president, was going to be recognized as such by Congress. And that the only way that a crowd who marched on the Capitol could do that was by breaching the Capitol and actually intervening. To this, you could add that although we can't get inside of Donald Trump's mind to know exactly what he intended, nevertheless, he understood that the crowd was angry. He was himself angry. And if we believe the account according to which Donald Trump had a phone conversation with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy while the protesters were inside the Capitol, in which, according to McCarthy, as he's told others, McCarthy complained about this and told Trump to send the crowd home. And Trump said, well, Kevin, maybe these folks care more about the outcome of the election than you do. If that is an indication of Trump's state of mind at the time, and I think it could plausibly be said to be, then we have some evidence that Trump welcomed the breaching of the Capitol and was not only fine with it, but actually actively encouraging of it. If that's the case, then Trump's action would qualify as incitement, especially when you add in that we know that it was likely to cause that violent action, because it did. So we saw that happen in real time. So that's the strongest argument, I think, that can be made that this was incitement on behalf of Donald Trump. The strongest argument on the other side of that view, and this is the one that was expressed by Trump's lawyers in his own defense in the Senate, is that applying First Amendment principles, that Donald Trump's conduct did not violate the Brandenburg Standard and did not rise to the level of incitement. They point out that Trump did not say to the crowd, "Go be violent." In fact, to the contrary, at various points he said, "Go peacefully." They add, furthermore, that Trump did not go down to the Capitol with the crowd. He said he would, but he didn't actually do it, and that he didn't see in real time that the crowd was on the edge of invading the Capitol, and therefore, in that sense, could not be said to have incited the action. The point here is to say that the president was not the immediate cause of the attack on the Capitol, and therefore should not count as having committed incitement under the First Amendment. Now, I want to take a step deeper behind each of these two views before turning to the secondary question of, was this an insurrection? And the step deeper is to ask, why, apart from partisan motivation, do people who want to see this kind of a speech as incitement see it that? And why might people on the other side not want to see a speech like this as incitement? And I think the core difference has to do with two different views about how secure and safe our government, a constitutional government, in practice is against various kinds of threats. And here we're coming very close to the theme that the program is most interested in, the theme of security. If you believe that even constitutional liberal democracies are vulnerable to subversion, to being smashed, to being broken down, and you might have the example of Weimar Germany before you, a liberal constitutional democratic regime that then gave way to Nazism without fighting back too hard. The state was simply much too vulnerable and much too weak. So if you believe that liberal constitutional democracies are vulnerable in that way, then you will think that it is necessary to identify speech like Donald Trump's as incitement and to outlaw it and to punish it. Because you will have the belief that if we allow such speech, the consequences may be so grave for the rule of law that we lose democracy itself. To give you a historical example of someone who had exactly this worry, Justice Robert Jackson, who was the Supreme Court Justice and who famously took a year of leave from the Supreme Court to go and be the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War, to prosecute Nazi war criminals. Justice Jackson was very worried when he returned from Nuremberg that free speech law was too protective of speech. And in a famous case called Dennis against the United States, a 1950 case, when the Supreme Court was deciding whether to uphold the convictions of the 12 most senior members of the Communist Party of the USA, Jackson, who voted alongside the majority in that case, a bare majority, to uphold the convictions, said in his opinion, listen, Holmes's old idea about clear and present danger, and he would say the same thing about the Brandenburg test, although it came later, was perfectly fine for situations where a minor and unimportant person is basically howling at the wind with outlying political views. But, said Jackson, in the modern age, when regimes like the Nazis or parties like the Communist Party are capable and sophisticated enough to build up resistance to government over time in a very thoughtful, careful, strategic way, he said we need to be able to prohibit that speech which leads to the collapse of democracy. Because he was worried, given what he'd seen prosecuting in Nuremberg, about the weakness of liberal democracy. So there's an example of someone who was on the side of saying, let's define incitement pretty broadly in order to protect liberal democracy. On the other hand, if you think that democracy in a constitutional society is very safe from fundamental subversion, is not on the edge of collapse, then you can tolerate a great deal, we can all tolerate a great deal of leeway, including in speech from people who are talking to a crowd, because even if something once in a while goes wrong and we get violence, as indeed happened at the Capitol, we as a society will survive it, and the cost of shutting down such speech is to limit effective political advocacy by people who have important public points to make. That was the view that the Supreme Court took in the Brandenburg case, and it's in general the view that many First Amendment advocates have. They think that the United States is a robust, secure constitutional democracy, and that we can tolerate lots of problematic speech. And if you say to somebody like that, well, what about the actual danger of violence? The best answer that can be made is that the response to violence is to have police protection to stop the violence from taking place. So a strong free speech advocate would say what went wrong on January 6th was not that Donald Trump was allowed to speak, and it's not even purely that the crowd turned violent. It's that the police protection and presence there was insufficient to protect the Capitol. Notice that this view of the safety and the strength of the liberal democracy depends on the idea that the liberal democracy has significant forces, power, deployed in the form of police, including maybe militarized police, capable of shutting down potential rioting even when it begins. So one thing that's not usually noticed about these 2 points of view is that the view that says the democracy might be weak, let's limit free speech, is ultimately a view that can go on either the left or the right of the political spectrum. It's not closely tied to one political position. And similarly, the view that says let's allow the speech to occur is not tied to one particular side of the political spectrum. And the very idea that we should have more speech is bound up, in this case, in the idea that we should have a strong state with powerful and effective police who are capable of shutting down rioting when it takes place. So that's pretty interesting. This position that says let's limit speech assumes that the state is not that capable of defending itself. The position that says let the speech go is a position that assumes the state is strong and capable of defending itself, and that it ought to do so, including through the use of force. This is one of those instances where you can see that sometimes the view that calls for greater liberty is also the view that calls for greater police presence. Okay, with those observations, let me turn now to the question of, was this an insurrection? And this is analytically severable or separable from the question of whether Donald Trump's speech functioned as incitement or not. We're talking now not about the president's speech, we're talking now about the actions of the crowd. An insurrection is ordinarily defined, not just in legal documents, but in the dictionary, as not just a protest and not just a disruption, but an active effort to overthrow a legitimate government, and to do so by force. Now, we know that the protesters did ultimately use force when they entered the Capitol, and potentially they could have used even greater force had they caught any congressmen or senators along the way. Was their conduct, therefore, insurrectionary? I'm going to do as I did in the first part of the discussion. I'm going to try to frame the strongest arguments on both sides. The argument that this was an insurrection says the democratic process is fundamentally focused on transitions. In a democracy, we have to have elections, but it's not a democracy if you just hold elections and then the results of those elections aren't put into effect. What makes it a democracy is that first you have elections, and then you actually execute the change of government based on that electoral result. The centerpiece of presidential electoral democracy in the United States is the moment when the votes from the Electoral College come in to Congress and are counted in front of all of Congress. Now, ordinarily, we don't pay much attention to that moment because we all know what's happened, and the person who lost the election has ordinarily conceded, and we're ready to move on. But that didn't happen this time, and so this particular public moment took on newfound public significance. Everyone seemed to understand that until that moment, there was still some outside chance that Joe Biden would not become president, but that after that moment, there was no question that Joe Biden would become president. Seen from that perspective, violently entering the Capitol with the goal of interfering in the count counted as a fundamental attempt to break the democratic system and to block the democracy from functioning, and to ideally have Donald Trump, who had not been elected president, stay president, and Joe Biden, who had been elected president, not become president. If you accept that view of what the protesters' intent was, you can see the logic of concluding that this was an insurrection, that it wasn't just a protest, it wasn't just a protest that went too far, it wasn't even just a protest turned violent, It was an attempt to break democracy, to make somebody president who was not elected, and in that sense did qualify as an insurrection in the deepest sense of the term. That's the view, again, that Congress expressed that the House of Representatives expressed when it adopted the article of impeachment that specifically spoke of incitement to insurrection. And indeed, in the immediate aftermath of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, even some prominent Republicans spoke of what had happened as an insurrection, suggesting that in real time, they had the sense that this wasn't just an attack on them or a protest against them, but rather a conscious effort to break the government and replace it with something new. So if you buy that view, you'll say this was an insurrection, and just to be clear, insurrections are serious business. An insurrection is a form of treason. Insurrection is a form of attempted revolution, and the sanctions that are appropriate for that are very serious and severe sanctions, criminal and otherwise. So the stakes of this question matter. It's not just a word. It matters a lot for the question of what should be done with the people who participated in the insurrection, if it was an insurrection, and also what should be done about Donald Trump if you believe that he incited that insurrection. What about the alternative view? Well, the alternative view says, look, go back and watch the tape again. The people who marched on the Capitol did believe that Donald Trump had won the election. But what they were trying to do was to send a symbolic message that they did not think that Trump should have to give up office, and they did not think that Joe Biden should become president. Now, you could stand and chant that, and that would not constitute an insurrection. And so runs the argument. First they chanted it, and then the crowd got drawn into actually breaking into the Capitol, which it did do, and it chanted and it yelled, and it did acts of violence and vandalism, and it temporarily disrupted the operation of what was going on in Congress. But, goes this argument, it was never plausible to imagine, and probably not even plausible for the people who entered the Capitol to imagine. I mean, maybe they might have imagined that, but maybe they were not people who were responsible to reality. Not plausible to imagine that the government of the United States would actually change as a consequence of this protest. And if you ask yourself, do you believe that view of what happened? Ask yourself what you thought when you flicked on the news after, seeing it online probably, and saw what was going on at the Capitol. Did you think in real time this protest might lead to Donald Trump staying president and to Joe Biden not becoming president? And I have to say, speaking only for myself, that at no point in watching these events with horror and condemnation and moral outrage did I think it had any chance of succeeding. At no point did I think that the protesters could do more than temporarily disrupt what was going on. At no point did I think that this would end with Donald Trump staying president. Now, you might say an insurrection is an insurrection even if it has no chance of success. And I'm sympathetic to that point of view. You could say that maybe the people intended an insurrection even though they knew it wouldn't work, and even though other people observing it knew that it wouldn't work. But I also think that insurrection implies that the people actually intended to transform the government into something different. And of course, it's a tricky business to say what intent means when applied to a large number of people, hundreds or thousands of people who breached the Capitol. But I think there is a respectable argument to be made that we go too far in referring to this protest gone awry as insurrection. Another way to ask yourself what you think about this is to try to imagine that there had been a different outcome to the election, that Donald Trump, let's say, had lost the popular vote by 7 or 8 million votes, but had won in the Electoral College. And then imagine that it had been a big protest of anti-Trump folks who were gathered outside the Capitol, and that they were chanting that the election was illegitimate because it did not reflect the popular will, even though they acknowledged, let's say, that Donald Trump had won in the Electoral College. And imagine that the protests got heated and got violent, and that the protesters breached the Capitol on that same day, at the same time. And ask yourself, would you think that that was an insurrection? Would you think that if the protesters were saying this is an illegitimate election, this is unfair, We think this is wrong. We think that Joe Biden should be president. Would that have been an insurrection? Now, you might say, well, that was just like what happened, and if you think one is an insurrection, you have to think the other is an insurrection, and I'm open to that view. But I also think it's conceivable that under those circumstances, lots of observers would have said, look, this is not an insurrection. This is not an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States. This is a dramatic and unnecessarily and inappropriately violent attempt to show the illegitimacy of the overall structure of the government. And so if you had that view, you would say, whatever this was, and you could condemn it morally, it nevertheless should not be categorized as an insurrection. Now, I mentioned that the stakes of this are high, this question of insurrection are high, for what you do about the people involved. I want to just close by noticing, before opening it up to conversation and discussion, that some of the same questions about the power and efficacy of the constitutional liberal state are in play in this question of whether it was an insurrection, just as they are in play in the question of whether Donald Trump's words constitute an incitement. How so? Well, in the following sense. If you think that the government is relatively vulnerable to being disrupted and overthrown, you might be inclined to say, oh, this was an insurrection and must be treated as such. We should be very worried about attempts to overthrow the government, and therefore when someone tries, however minor or ineffective their efforts, and in this case they weren't minor and they were ineffective, but they were not minor, you should call it what it is. We should call it an insurrection. We should crack down on it, because we, in the constitutional liberal state, need to be strong in policing the boundaries of our democracy, lest it be chipped away over time and ultimately collapse. That would be the Justice Jackson view. It would say, treat efforts to overthrow the government, even at the margin, as genuine efforts to overthrow the government, punish them and suppress them accordingly to protect the liberal state. Don't allow the liberal state, the constitutional liberal state, to be so vulnerable that it has a chance of collapse. The second view, the view that says we shouldn't treat this as an insurrection, would probably say, have a little more faith in the capacities of the constitutional state to withstand challenge. Just as protests are acceptable, even violent protests, which are wrong and should be punished, shouldn't be blown out of proportion and treated as though they amounted to serious efforts to overthrow the government. Lower the temperature. Punish people for their acts of violence if they participated. Punish them for trespassing and destroying federal property. But don't say that they were guilty of the crime of sedition, and don't charge them with attempting to overthrow the government of the United States by force of arms. The theory would be that even if you're on the margin, charging people with that actually signals the weakness of the state, because it makes the state seem weak because it can't tolerate or allow the relatively peripheral people who attempted these acts of violence. So notice that that's also a position. Both of these are positions that aren't tied to a particular partisan political position. And this latter really raises the question of which makes the state stronger. Is the democratic state stronger if it takes threats seriously and shuts them down? Or is the liberal democratic constitutional state stronger when it, to the contrary, treats those who challenge it as, criminals who need to be punished, yes, but not as people who have raised a genuine threat to the functional capacities of the government? A closing note, I've given my entire talk here in the context of the United States because these events took place in the United States, and you could say they were in some sense distinctively American. There is a view that says that it all depends on how strong the government is. If you're in a new democracy where legitimacy of electoral transitions is weak, goes the argument, then you should follow the Justice Jackson line. You should treat attempts to disturb the government by speech strongly and suppress them. You should treat attempts to interfere with the electoral process as insurrection, and you should punish them as such. But, runs that argument, if you're in an established, mature, safe democracy where you know things will come out all right in the end, you can afford to be more permissive with respect to speech, and you can afford to convey strength by not calling protests that go too far actual insurrections. What's fascinating, and to my mind deeply disturbing about the events of January 6th, is that they call into question that traditional way of looking at things, which says, well, if you're in a mature, safe democracy where you know it'll come out all right in the end, you can be permissive about speech. Because these events did happen in the United States. They did happen in the oldest, long-run, functioning, major constitutional democracy in the world. I know the Swiss would say theirs is longer running. And they did not take place in what is at least nominally a banana republic. They did not take place in a country that has only recently transitioned to democracy where the norms are uncertain. They took place right here in the country that invented written constitutionalism in the United States. And it's sort of astonishing that they did. And so they call into question not only what approach one should take, but they call into question a factual matter of how vulnerable is the government of the United States to disruption or even violent overthrow at moments of electoral crisis. I'm going to betray a little bit of my own view here just at the very end. To my mind, when it comes to the legitimacy of electoral results, the events of the last 3 months show that the United States is much less secure with respect to the capacity of one political party or another to undermine faith in democracy and elections than I would have predicted. I would not have predicted that a sitting president could have begun impugning the legitimacy of an election before it even happened, could have continued to do so afterwards, could have declined to show up at the swearing in of his successor, and could still, to this late date, never have fully acknowledged the legitimacy of the transformation when there was almost no evidence of any kind whatsoever to support his views. The idea that a significant number of Americans still believe today that the election was illegitimate suggests to me that our system is much more vulnerable with respect to impugning the legitimacy of the elections than I would otherwise have expected. And that cuts in favor of a more rigorous view of the events of January 6th. On the other hand, it's also my view that at no point on January 6th was there any credible chance that the government of the United States would collapse or that the transition would not take place. That is, my faith in the institutions of the government remains very strong, just as I had a very strong faith in the capacities of the local municipal officials who counted ballots all over the United States to make fair, honest, and good decisions the day of the election and the days after, which is exactly what happened. They did so regardless of what political party they belonged to. They did their jobs, and we did not see meaningful evidence of any electoral fraud, and nor was it claimed by the people who were actually in a position to know. And the courts followed that by overwhelmingly 62 out of 63 cases deciding for the Biden administration and not for Donald Trump. And in that last case, it was just a small procedural matter. So no court in the United States, not even one, went down the road of following the president to his denial of the election results. So in that respect, with respect to the insurrection question, I think we're in a stronger position. The United States government is in a stronger position than it might otherwise appear to be. So that's a mixed view. We're more vulnerable on the big picture of denying electoral legitimacy. We're less vulnerable, to my view, on the more practical question of whether transition was ever in any doubt. Thank you for listening to that analysis. I hope I've managed to rile people up on both sides with my account, and I'm very eager to hear your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Noah. That was really fascinating presentation. So for all of you out there in the audience, please present your questions in the Q&A box, and then I'll do my best to get to all of them. So really briefly, in regards to the incitement, you present a very compelling argument. You're talking about both sides and focusing largely on President Trump's speech just prior to the movement of the crowd to the Capitol building. I'm wondering, legally and with a broad sense of the legal, how would you interpret and understand and engage the broader context of the discourse at the time, both the discourse from the president's statements and the larger discourse circulating around by supporters related to stop the steal and specific comments about the illegitimacy of the election? What role do these contextual components have to a legal analysis of incitement?
That's a great question. They matter insofar as they would give meaning and context to the president's speech. So if there had been no claim that the election had been stolen, there would, I think, be no way to interpret the president's speech as inciting a violent effort to interfere with the decision-making process. Had Trump not been, telling Mike Pence to do the right thing and saying so in his speech, it would have been much harder to make out the case. With that context, it is plausible to say that the president was trying to get the crowd actually to intervene in a violent way. The problem is that even with all of that narrative, it doesn't follow inevitably that the president's speech was directed to inciting violence, because a lot of the narrative and the discourse that Trump engaged in the previous month was aimed at lawful mechanisms of interference, right? I mean, Trump was going to court 63 times. Trump was trying to get, and successfully got, significant numbers of congressmen to dispute the validity of electoral votes, including the electoral votes from Pennsylvania, where 140 members of the House and I think 7 or 8 members of the Senate actually then voted to say that those votes should not be accepted, that wasn't enough to win. And those were, though in my view those were illegitimate, I think the criticism was illegitimate, the votes were illegitimate, they were lawful, and they weren't violent. And so calling for that to happen did not count as incitement under the law. So Trump is able to defend himself, and was able to defend himself, by saying, in part, look, saying it was stolen is not the same as saying I'm calling for the violent entrance into the Capitol.
A question here from Craig Calhoun, a colleague who's actually going to be speaking in our speaker series on March 11th, and former president of London School of Economics, and a great addition to ASU. It's a rather long question, so I'm going to read the whole thing. Is violence an essential element of insurrection? And is violence only acts of bodily harm to others, or does it include acts of intimidation and acts of material harm to institutions? Or can any attempt to overthrow the established institutions of government, including elections, be termed insurrection? In that case, could we not see all exhortation to ignore or act against a legitimate election as incitement to insurrection? And should we not see all those seeking to force disregard of the legitimate election as engaged in insurrection, including not just the January 6th mob, but Trump himself, a variety of activists, and perhaps legislators?
I love that question because it draws direct attention to a difference between the way lawyers use the word insurrection and the way ordinary speakers of English, like normal people, use the word insurrection. And neither is the correct way to use it. For lawyers, insurrection is the call for the violent overthrow of a government. It's overthrow by force. And in that sense, it's distinct from calling for the peaceful process of political transformation and change, including by revolution. So if you call for peaceful revolution, by electoral means or by nonviolence, that would not qualify as insurrection under U.S. law, as defined in a whole host of statutes. I also think if you look at the dictionary definitions, you probably will see mostly for insurrection that it does include the idea of not merely replacing the government, but by doing so by force. That said, I don't think that definition is the only definition that could be used. And that terrific question draws attention to the possibility that if you're seeking to delegitimate the democracy, you could be doing so in a way that is calling for the overthrow of the government, but just isn't calling for its overthrow by force or violence. That would be a much broader definition of insurrection. And then the question would be, I think, is that a useful definition? And I think the answer is, if you believe that democracies are vulnerable not merely to violent overthrow, but to insidious, let's say, cultural overthrow of delegitimation and the belief that nothing is real. If you think democracies are so vulnerable, then you might find it really useful to call those not necessarily violent acts of delegitimation types of insurrection. If, on the other hand, you think that we should draw a hard line between peaceful undercutting and violent undercutting, then you'll want to stick with a more rigorous definition of insurrection, because then the word insurrection is useful for delineating violence. I just would note here a fascinating passage by the same Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, whom I mentioned, who came up with the clear and present danger test, in an opinion that came out just a couple years later called Gitlow. Holmes, in a dissent, um, said that he had a sentence that is one of the more shocking sentences ever written by a Supreme Court justice all while on the bench. And what he said is, and I'm paraphrasing, but only by a little bit, if the people of the United States should ultimately decide to adopt the dictatorship of the proletariat, that it is the meaning of my job and of free speech to enable them to do so. I mean, get a load of that. There's a Supreme Court justice who is one of the most important figures in the history of free speech jurisprudence, saying that if the public wants, over time, to adopt a system of government that communism was advocating for, which would outlaw free speech and would indeed outlaw all of democracy, the dictatorship of the proletariat, he saw his job as enabling that to happen by virtue of allowing people to advocate for it. Now, how could Holmes say that? It's because he's resting on the idea of a distinction between peaceful efforts and arguments for overthrowing government and violent efforts. Holmes did not think it was a requirement of him to stand by and allow violent overthrow to occur. He thought that any non-violent advocacy had to be allowed even when it delegitimated government, even if it would lead to the end of government itself. Now, Holmes had a radical view on this. It's a radical formulation, and you could say that it's a rhetorical flourish, but he did say it. And that view is the view that undergirds the notion that we should rigorously distinguish violence from nonviolence with respect to governmental change. The alternative view would be like the view that I ascribe to Justice Jackson, which is that it doesn't matter if people are not advocating violence. If their effect is going to lead to revolutionary transformation of a bad kind, then we should do something about that. And on that view, I think you could take a broader definition of insurrection.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to take two questions and put them together because there's some relation between them and they play off of your last point. From Richard Baker, I'm perplexed by the argument that these anarchists didn't want to throw out the election results and keep Trump as president. That was their intention despite no chance of success. Mm-hmm. And a related question, Diane Wachtel, if the mob had succeeded in killing members of Congress or the vice president, which they clearly said they intended to do, would it more clearly be an insurrection?
Yeah, those are both great points. And they both go to one of the hardest things to do in making sense of events like the events of January 6th, which is making sense of group intentions. So you had people who were unified in the objective of breaking into the Capitol. And I think they were also unified in the objective of interfering with what Congress was doing. And certainly they seemed also to all think that Donald Trump ought to be president of the United States. So I think we could derive those things from their words and their actions. But does it follow from that they really thought that their intention was actually to overthrow the government and to force the Congress to make Donald Trump president, or get the Defense Department to call out the troops and make Donald Trump president? It's that last step that's the crucial question in defining insurrection. And I am not completely convinced that you can say, yes, that was their intent. Because I think intent involves some capacity to foresee likely outcomes. Unless you're completely delusional. You could say, oh, they were completely delusional, or you can say, I'm easily convinced from the evidence that they did intend to forcibly make Donald Trump president. I'm not sure of that. I think a lot of them probably thought they were going to have a big impact, show the illegitimacy of the system, and no doubt some of them genuinely believed that at the end of the day, Donald Trump would be made president for another 4 years. It's hard to know what the percentages were, and it's hard to fully figure out exactly what the group wanted given those different points of view. And I think the same is true as well with respect to to Diane Wachtel's question. Yes, had there been acts of physical violence against congressmen, that would look a lot more like an effort to overthrow the government. I think it would have that effect, right? Yet it still could be argued on the other side, even if they had, caught a Democratic congressman or caught Mike Pence and done harm to them, and thank goodness that didn't happen. It could still have been argued that was a, mob reacting in anger in the moment, rather than a self-conscious effort to successfully, actually to change the course of government. So I think it's a great question. I've struggled myself with this counterfactual. I've asked, would Donald Trump have been removed by the Senate? Well, he couldn't be removed because he was already out of office, but would he have been barred from serving again by the Senate had there been violence done? You can play it all out. Violence done to a Democratic congressman, violence done to a Republican congressman, violence done to Mike Pence, violence done to Kamala Harris. I guess Kamala Harris wasn't there. Violence done to police who were injured, and some of whom died, but were not immediately shot and killed by the mob. I think those are all really hard questions, and I think we should ask ourselves those hypotheticals.
A question from David Pickus. Again, kind of long, so I'll read it out. Professor, I belong to the Justice Jackson side, even though I can see the improbability of an actual coup on January 6th. However, I don't think Jackson was only responding to the weakness of the Weimar Republic. He was also responding to a very cunning aspect of the Nazis, namely the dual state ideology, whereby one, laws stay in force, but also two, another group is labeled the true nation and flat out rewarded when it commits violence. Would you agree that the fact that much of January 6th was clownish, that fact is less important than the fact that the mob, with presidential endorsement, defined itself as the true America, thereby seeking to invalidate anyone else's recourse to the law?
I mean, that's a very, very rich question with different moving parts. I will say that for sure, when he was preparing for the Nuremberg trial, Jackson studied the rise of the Nazis carefully, and he was certainly attuned both to the ideological move that they made of claiming to be the true bearers of German national identity, as well as the street violence techniques that they used. But I think in his opinion in Dennis, and in another opinion that Justice Jackson wrote in a case called Terminiello against Chicago, which was another fascinating free speech case, a situation where a very unpopular speaker, a guy called Father Terminiello, who was they called him the Father Coughlin of the South. He was another Catholic priest who gave radio addresses typically that were vituperatively racist and anti-Semitic and so forth and so on. He gave a speech in Chicago, and lots of members of the crowd responded with violence towards him. And he was subsequently arrested under a statute, or an ordinance rather, that made it a crime to provoke and anger people. And the Supreme Court, with Justice Douglas writing the opinion for the majority, struck down the conviction, saying that he had to be allowed to speak. And Justice Jackson, writing in a dissent, said, again invoking Weimar Germany, he said, look, the Nazis' approach was to try to get control of the streets. And they battled communists and socialists in the streets with the goal of establishing control and thereby eventually taking over the state. So again, there in that decision, Jackson showed a very nuanced focus on the tactics that the Nazis used, not just their ideological arguments, but the tactics that they actually used. And Jackson concluded that we needed to be much more protective against things like that. So, I think Jackson was attuned to the other. The second part of the question, though, focuses on just how upsetting it was that the protesters said they were the true America. And there, I guess I would say at a moral level, I agree with the question that it's horrifying when people whom I deeply disagree with call themselves the true America. But that's the classic instance, to my mind, of where the right answer is to meet that false speech with truer speech. It has to be allowed in American public discourse for people to say, I am the real American. And for someone else to say, no, you're not. I'm the real American. And if nobody's using violence, that's just called intense political dispute. So I would be cautious about saying that feature of the protesters would justify treating them as an insurrection. I think there's all kinds of speech disagreement in the United States that plays out along those lines. I prefer never to speak that way, but when someone else says I'm the true America, then I want to stand up and say, oh, no, you're not.
A question here from Laura Roskin, a longtime friend of the center and a deep contributor and supporter of ASU. Our founding fathers abhorred a mob. In our imagination, just imagine if they were observing the events of January 6th. What do you think Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton would be wondering? And as a person who wrote a book about Madison, maybe you could highlight that, about the impact of those actions on the claims and structure and solidity of our liberal democracy.
Well, I think the questioner she's completely right. The founders really abhorred a mob for two reasons. First, their highest political value was calm, reasoned discussion. And that's where Madison would have probably been focused. He would have said, it just represents the breakdown of everything that constitutional democracy is devoted to if instead of having a conversation and a discussion and exchanging views, we're screaming, yelling, and rampaging. So in that sense, it's very destructive to democracy to have that kind of mob politics because the essence of democracy is rational discourse. The other reason that the framers didn't like mobs is they were afraid of them. The framers understood that mob politics could actually break their very fragile systems of government that they had. I mean, now we can debate how strong our constitutional democracy is, but at the time, there was no doubt that their system of government was very, very fragile. And so, a good example of that is that in the months leading up to the first Constitutional Convention, the main Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, there had been some mob events in Massachusetts, in western Massachusetts. Tax protesters who were arguably justifiably very upset about the way that the East Coast elites in Massachusetts had basically borrowed the money to pay the soldiers in the Revolutionary War. And then when they had to pay the bill, they taxed the same people, the same ordinary soldiers who were now farmers. They imposed high taxes on them in order to pay them the money that they owed them. And so Western Massachusetts farmers were enraged, and in Shays's rebellion, they basically gathered in large mobs, and when courts came to try to, say you didn't pay your taxes, we're going to take your farm, they were like, oh, no, you don't. And ultimately, the state was not strong enough to respond. And the East Coast elites ended up hiring a private army to go out and put down Shays's rebellion. And Washington was terrified by this. And many of the other framers were worried about it too. They saw the vulnerability of the democratic institutions they had. I think if they looked at the events of January 6th from that perspective, they would be less afraid of the capacity of the mob to take down the government, because our government is so much more powerful than it was at the time. But they would have been just devastated and troubled by the collapse of the idea of civic discourse.
A question here from an anonymous attendee. For many voters, questions remain about the 2020 election improprieties. The Wall Street Journal op-ed page today notes unconstitutional changes to the electoral process, for example, extending the deadline for mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania by state officials and the courts rather than by elected representatives of the state Congress. Many are concerned that no censure of such practice will lead to further corruption in future elections. Similarly, in Arizona, even the Republican governor declined to call for an audit of ballot counting. If there is no attempt to avoid corruption, including ballot harvesting in future elections, the entire process may be undermined, will it not?
I'm so glad, Daniel, that you read that question out, and I'm thankful to the person for asking it, because it really captures, and maybe this is a reasonable place to close, it captures the biggest challenge that we all face in the aftermath of the events of January 6th. And that is just deeply disparate, polarized beliefs about what happened in the election. The questioner points to the Pennsylvania legislative extension of judicial extension of the deadline for ballots, which was ultimately upheld by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and on which the U.S. Supreme Court declined to grant cert, declined to hear the case to reverse it. So the legal process was played out. You may think that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court got it wrong, and you may think that the Supreme Court got it wrong. And three justices of the Supreme Court yesterday said that they thought the Supreme Court should have revisited this issue. The other six, so that means not just a partisan breakdown, thought that the case was moot and that the court shouldn't revisit it. So there are lots of people out there who have the view that the questioner is asking and who see our elections as deeply, potentially subject to illegitimacy. And on the other hand are people who think that the election was perfectly legitimate and that the grave danger is not of cheating in elections, but rather of systematic delegitimation of the electoral process by the people who lose in the elections, using arguments like the ones that were made in Pennsylvania, or like the argument that says, we have to watch out for quote-unquote ballot harvesting, which is itself a contentious term describing something for which there is no, in my view at least, no demonstrable evidence from the last election at all. I would say the biggest challenge facing our country is not really even what happened on January 6th, but the possibility that we will be divided into two blocks with different views of the legitimacy of electoral democracy itself, each side thinking that the other is inclined to break the system. And here, just to close by invoking the framers again, the framers, especially Madison, believed that democracy, republicanism, as they called it, rested on a system of what they considered the virtue of the citizens. And by virtue of the citizens, they meant, just at the most basic level, that people believed in the common enterprise that they were involved in, believed that the people on the other side were people of relatively goodwill, and believed you could resolve things by voting on them. If you don't trust the outcome of a vote, then you don't think that you can resolve problems by voting on them. And if you think the other side is stealing elections, you don't think that the other side basically is motivated by goodwill, even if you disagree with them. And in the presence of those feelings, it is very difficult to maintain what the framers considered political virtue at a collective level. And to my mind, that's the deepest fear. That's the deepest fear that I have about the future of our democracy. I am, by nature, an optimist, and I hope and trust that over the next 4 years to the next presidential election, we will move towards greater transparency and legitimacy around the electoral process in a way that all sides can trust the results. That is my fervent hope. It's also my strong sense of what we ought to be doing. But if we don't do that, the stakes are really high. The only way to survive as a republic and as a functioning constitutional democracy is to trust the process as functional. And the minute you start thinking that it's not functional, if a lot of people think it's not functional, that can be self-fulfilling, and it really won't be. So that's where the security of the United States is most endangered. But I think there's a path forward. The path forward is greater transparency, greater clarity, bipartisan commissions to make it clear that the election is in fact working. It would be nice not to have a pandemic in the middle of the next election. That would also be good. But I think we're capable of achieving that. We've been divided in the past. We will be divided again in the future. But we've managed to hold together with the notable exception of the Civil War. And I think we will be capable of doing it again this time.
Thank you so much, Noah Feldman. Thank you to all of the members of the audience who've joined us this evening. We really appreciate your taking the time. Special thanks to Selena Daniel, our center coordinator, who's put all the logistics together, sent out all the invitations. And we wish you all a very good night. It's nice to end on an optimistic note, and we're thrilled that we were able to bring Noah Feldman to all of you and to engage these questions of security and bringing up issues of trust in the United States in a way that I think resonates hopefully for everybody here and really does sort of chart the way forward, both in present dangers and also maybe some ways forward. So thank you again, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Dave.